Hello and welcome to Connected, the Sunday Business Post Technology podcast brought to you in association with Dell EMC. I'm Emmett Ryan, and yes, like I said, we're back. We aren't quite in the studio yet, but we're getting closer and closer to it. Only an episode or two to go before studio mode. And our guest this week is a man who was at the Dublin Data Summit last month, I suppose, will be at the time of publication. No, it was June, it was this month. Yeah. Although by the time this comes out, it'll actually be July, so it'll be last month. How things go. Anyway, David Bray has a lot of jobs. He's an Eisenhower Fellow to Australia and Taiwan. He is a Harvard Executive in Residence, and probably most important to this broadcast, he is the Chief Information Officer at the Federal Communications Commission in the United States. And that's a lot of hats to wear. I think there's no dancing around that. The man has a pretty busy life. And in fact, we're going to learn over the course of this show that he's actually moving on to another role as well, which will make him even busier. But I suppose we wanted to start out by finding out what the CIO of the FCC does, because the Federal Communications Commission has been around for a very long time. In recent years, the amount of media that affect it and it affects has substantially increased and sort of broadened the scope of what it has to do as an organization. So I essentially started out with asking David probably the most obvious but also necessary question. That is, what does the CIO of the FCC do?
I'm a nonpartisan senior executive, which means in the States, I sort of translate what direction we receive, in this case from the chairman and the other commissioners at the FCC, to what we do as a staff. And I'm focusing on the IT and the technology initiatives of the FCC. When I arrived in 2013, there had been 9 CIOs in 8 years, which I say is always a good sign for CIO number 10 that things are just going swimmingly. Good news is that was about 4 years ago, so I'm at least at least 3 times past the average.
You're considered actual staff now as opposed to somebody passing through.
Right, exactly. And when I first arrived, in fact, when I talked to the team, I asked, I said, how many people were optimistic about the future? 15% said they were. Another 50% were honest enough. They said, we're just going to see if you last the next 6 months. And some people wanted to go back to the way things were in the 1990s when there were more government versus contractors. But more importantly, when I arrived, there were 207 different IT systems that the FCC had, relative to only 2,000 people. So I jokingly said, I feel like Oprah Winfrey looking at your chair. Congratulations, everyone's winning an IT system today.
Like, you get an IT system.
You get to go home with it, exactly. And they were all on premise. The average age was more than 10 years old. We had some that were approaching 20 years or longer. And so that was clearly not a sustainable path. We were also spending more than 85% of our IT budget just to maintain the systems, not to do anything new. So the good news is, less than 2 years later, by a combination of what I call empowering positive change agents, people willing to step outside the status quo amongst the team, and just setting the vision and saying this is where we're going to go, in less than 2 years, we moved everything to public cloud and commercial service provider. Nothing is now on premise at headquarters anymore. And even more importantly, we reduced our spend from being 85% to maintain our systems to being less than 50%. So that was on a flat budget. We've not seen a budget increase in the last 7 years. And finally, the most interesting side effect was, instead of taking 6 or 7 months now to stand up a new system, if you come into me with requirements, we can get you a working prototype in 48 hours.
And so what have you dropped from the 205? What's that dropped down to number?
It's probably now a little bit less than 90 or so. So we retired some.
Yeah, that's good. That's good for some context, because I know regulars to Connected would know this. When I joined the Business Post about 3.5 years ago, so a little bit basically before you started your job, we had a system for content management which was from 1986, which was still in use, and they only retired in early 2014. We had journalists younger than the CMS we were using.
Of course.
I sadly wasn't one of them. Now, the number though that's jumping out for, I think people listen to the 205, will listen to this, is the 9 CIOs in 8 years.
Yes.
So you're number 10. What had happened that there was that level of turnover?
Well, I think so. The challenge is how do you lead change in a legacy environment? FCC has been around since the 1930s, so we're more than 80 years old. And on top of it, it's public service, which, as we know, has established processes. In some respects, those processes exist to have checks and balances. But the very process of having checks and balances also make it hard to change things. I mean, we operate on a 3-year budget cycle in the U.S., so trying to set this path in less than 2 years is challenging. And so if you come in thinking you're going to be top down and you're going to tell everyone what to do, you're quickly going to be out of a job. At the same time, it also has to recognize that by moving from on-premise legacy IT to public cloud, the average person had been at the FCC for 15 and a half years. The average contractor had been at the FCC for 19 years. So the contractors have been there longer than the government employees, on average. And here I am saying we're going to go to a new model, which is we're going to go to cloud. Well, the incumbent contractors realize they might be out of a job. So they start whispering in the ears of their friends, saying this guy's crazy, what's he doing? And so if you don't come in with that awareness...
If it was any comfort, I would have done it to you as well.
Exactly. and it's okay to say I'm crazy. But part of my job then is to be basically managing the friction and finding buy-in where I can actually empower you and say, look, I almost want to operate like an internal venture capitalist, which is how can we get to 100% public cloud in a certain time period? If you have an idea, make a pitch, and I may invest in you. And actually I ask, give me 3 reasons why we should do this, but even more importantly, because we are in public service, 3 reasons why we should not. And maybe there's a law in the way, or maybe there's a rule in the way, or maybe it's some stakeholder is going to feel disadvantaged. And then how are we going to address those 3 reasons why we should not? And so it's almost like second and third order thinking about, don't just do it because it's a good idea, but also think about how you're going to manage the friction of moving forward. And sure enough, like we had one example, we had a 15-year-old consumer help desk that was public facing. So if you had a complaint, you could actually log it and we'd deal with the providers.
Deadspin loved that, I recall.
Yes. And so we wanted to update it because it's 15 years old. You literally had to download one of 18 different PDF forms, which it's like, well, who does that anymore? Print it out, fill it out by hand, and either fax it, who has a fax machine anymore, or scan it back to the FCC. And it's like, that's not state of the art for 2015. So instead we wanted to modernize it.
State of the art for quite a while.
Yes.
Yes.
But again, we also had budget sequestration. So, whenever you have tight budgets and people say do more with less, well, the answer means no new IT. But what we found was if we asked the people on premise, they said, well, it's going to take 18 to 24 months. The existing private sector contractor said it might cost $3.2 million. And I was like, I don't have $3.2 million. And one of our change agents actually came and said, no, we can go to software as a service with a public cloud, commercial cloud offering, do it for less than $450,000, so 1/6 the price, and get it done in less than the next 60 days. And sure enough, they did. It actually was done in 60 days, another 4 months of like socializing with outside stakeholders. But our biggest resistance was people that said, well, I'm going to lose control of my data. Where's my data going? It's like, it's in the cloud. It's okay. And then other people saying, well, we are used to the 18 different forms. And I was like, well, I'm sure if you go to the outside, most people are not used to 18 different forms. They almost want to have like TurboTax, where you start answering a question in less than 7 answers, you've automatically filled out a form and not even known it. It's much more convenient that way. And so I brought in outside stakeholders to say they wanted to do it. But we still had big resistance. I mean, the people on the inside were not my friends when we went live. But about 3 to 6 months later, they started turning around and said, well, you're right, this is actually saving us time. And in about 9 months, there was a Forbes article that said how the FCC saved me more than $1,000 because they had a complaint with a provider and actually got it done and resolved in less than 3 days because the system was much faster than the old paper-based fax something in system. And so part of leadership is being willing to step outside of expectations, but also being brave enough to build a coalition and bring them along too.
And I'm just thinking with the FCC, like as a body, like going back to like, sort of when I'd have been a kid, like what it had to deal with as a breadth, the idea of media was so much narrower than what it is now.
Oh, it's huge.
So I'm guessing on the CIO level and on a technical level, that presents its own challenges. There's the usual controversy ones, which are main headline stuff, but I'm guessing on an administrative level, it must be a huge challenge.
Yeah, so it is a challenge that if anything, we have information overload. I like to point out to people, for most of human species existence, you ran into 80 people total in your entire lifespan, and most of them were your immediate family members. I'm sure today we're all going to run into more than 80 people, and they're not going to be any of our family members. And so our brains are not prepared for the environment we're in, and that's okay.
You clearly haven't lived in Dublin if you reckon you aren't going to run into a family member today. Okay.
That's true. It may be a little bit different here, and if I go to the local pub, I might.
Ireland's just weird like that. Like,
well, that's good. But at the same time, you will also have different people as well, and so there are. It's a combination of media. It's a combination of information overload. How do you make sense of all this? So one of the things I did when I arrived at the FCC fairly early on is I said I wanted to have a Twitter account, and they said, well, why do you have a Twitter account? I said, well, our middle name is Federal Communications. And they said, well, okay, you can do one, but in your personal capacity. And I said, I don't think they'll care about me personally. I mean, that's not why I'm here. I think it's more about the role. And they said, well, you can't use the word FCC. And I said, well, we're foreign correspondents in China. We're not unique. And so I actually ended up creating it, and Public Affairs wasn't too happy. But about 6 or 7 months later, they actually warmed back up. But more importantly, it was to share that, look, we've got tight budgets. One of the things I found on day 2 in my job is I found a still unopened 56K modem in my desk. And so I actually took a photo of it and said, found at the FCC, hopefully our modernization efforts will be better than a 56K modem. But it was really just to have a sense of humor and say, look, we've got scarce resources, we've got multiple demands, I'm not political, I'm nonpartisan, but we're going to try and make the best of the situation. And it ended up having a lot of followers. I think now it's got more than 75,000 followers. But it really was just a conversation that, look, this is hard. We need creative problem solvers. Let's try to move forward together to make sense of both what we can do to modernize the FCC and make sense of the world ahead too.
And like you look at sort of the next couple of years in your role, is assuming you keep in it, David, although you've done pretty well age-wise, like considering your predecessors. Like if you are still going to be doing it in the next 18 to 24 months, or for whoever does it instead of you, what do you see as the key challenges?
Yeah. So actually, I can say first, I actually have already made an announcement that in about a month and a half, I'll actually be stepping into a new role, but we can talk about that later. But for my successor, and this was voluntary, by the way, to go to a new role. It was an excitement. My successor, it's all about organizational empathy. Again, average person being there for more than 15 years. These are people that mean well. I mean, you sign up for public service, quite frankly. I mean, at least in the States, you don't get paid a glorious salary. They've not seen increases or anything like that. You sign up because you want to make a difference. But the challenge is you may do that for 2 or 3 years and you're hitting your head against the wall, you're fighting against the bureaucracy, which is there partly by design to prevent any one person from getting too much control, but you get frustrated. And so you may lose that initial joy that brought you in. And if the right leader comes in and can actually rekindle that joy, one of the questions I like to ask people is exactly that, which is what brings you joy? Why are you here? What makes you passionate? You can give people autonomy, you can give them measurable progress on their goals and a meaningful mission, and that'll move the organization forward. But if instead you're trying to be top-down or shouting at people and not giving people autonomy, you're going to be quickly out of a job.
So tell us about the new job.
Sure. So the new job is actually with what's called the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, which basically...
You really like to add as many words into what you do in your life as possible.
Well, you have to recognize we have these things called TLAs and EMLAs. TLAs are 3-letter acronyms, and EMLAs are excessive multi-letter acronyms. You are now part of the club, and so you've been read in. It's part of the culture. But yeah, so the role will be as their Chief Ventures Officer, which has never existed before. And it literally has been more than 12 months in negotiations and conversations. But basically what it's going to be is, much like the FCC, where there was a legacy culture, legacy IT, National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, I mean, we are drowning in data. At the same time, just to give you a sense of the context, just one collection source per day collects the equivalent of 3 years of all the National Football League games in the United States.
Wow.
So you can imagine sitting an analyst down and saying, watch these 3 years of football games, if you even do it in one day, which you probably could not.
And I'm actually buddies with one of the guys in Pro Football Focus, so I know how much they've got to do. So that's just terrifying to me.
And so we're drowning in data, and so we're going to have to start to use machine learning. We're going to have to start to use autonomous systems. But you don't want to get this wrong. I mean, these are in some cases life or death decisions. You want to make sure, and also we want to be more open about it too. I mean, the nice thing about the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency is it does play a role if there's an earthquake, if there's an outbreak. In Nepal, when there was an earthquake, they made their data available to everybody in the world. Same thing when the Ebola outbreak and the Zika virus, they made that data available as well. And so there is the opportunity to do things in unclassified settings that are more open and participatory. And there's also this interesting premise, which is with machine learning, what's really valuable is the data that you use to teach the machine. If you can trust the data, you're going to have a better machine algorithm or neural network than if the data is spurious or something like that. And so we think the premise is that we're sitting on top of interesting data that can actually be used to actually allow commercial companies in, teach their machine against it. If they later spin off and they do their own thing, that's great. But it can also allow us to create advances in geospatial that are advantage to us all to make sense of this world we're going into. Just to give you a sense of the change, as I mentioned, less than 5 years, 96 billion terabytes of data, which is more than all human eyes have seen in the course of a year. We're going to have to use machine learning.
Absolutely. And you look at like the sort of machine learning and its role, but in terms of how it's developing as a technology, because obviously for you to use it, it needs to, well, it's getting good, don't get me wrong, but it probably needs to get a lot better, I reckon.
Yeah, it does have to get a lot better. In fact, there's already examples of where you can teach a machine to, say, recognize the difference between a panda and an eggplant. Okay, so you've taught the machine, but then you can add some noise to the image that is not visible to the human eye, and it'll all of a sudden start misidentifying that panda as being an eggplant or vice versa. And so it's this almost evolving science of image integrity. Can you trust the image?
And that's when you've got to be careful with as well, because if machines are trying to make sure we don't run out of pandas, like that's going to end
or
pretty
eggplants.
badly.
I'm worried about the eggplants too.
Well, we got more eggplants,
Okay.
like, you know.
But the pandas, yes. And so it raises interesting questions, which is, you know, as we already know, there's questions about what can you trust on the internet in terms of news, but can you actually start questioning the images? And it was actually a study done by the Pew Internet Society. It was about 8 years ago. About 1 in 5, 1 in 4 images on the internet have been doctored in terms of news to make them either like more smoke or additional, like, you know, sensationalism and things like that.
And that goes back forever, like the infamous Kent State photo, which for those listening who don't understand, that the Kent State shootings in the 70s, there was a pole right behind somebody who was crying over a dead body. They doctored out the pole, and because it would look better on the page, not realizing they're interfering with a serious piece of history. So it's a long-term problem. Like
yes, exactly. And so yeah, exactly. It's, if anything, the internet is a reflection of all humanity, and all humanity. I mean, we humans do great things. We do also a lot of silly or mundane things like cat photos, which, you know, is all great, and then we also do some awful things too.
And I suppose in terms of sort of, you know, looking at sort of not just your role in the future, but also your other roles, so to speak, because you're a busy guy. So just people who don't know about what you're doing in those, you know, particularly like the Harvard one, like, you know, what do they actually involve? Like, because they're not really day to day the way you're describing them.
Sure. So with Harvard, that's in a connection that was forged about 3.5 years ago. It's what's called leadership in a network world. And it's recognizing that the style of leadership and the approaches to leadership that used to work, say, in the 50s and the 40s, just don't scale for network world. And again, it's sort of like I already mentioned. I mean, the nice thing is I get to put in what my academic teachings are. I actually get to put them in real life action, which is empower the edge, recognize that, again, no one has all the answers. And if you try to restrict people's autonomy, you're going to take away their motivation to do great things. At the same time, it's been shown that you need to have a diversity of perspectives. There's actually been, time and time again with experiments, if you have a group of experts compete against a group of what's called experts and naive participants, so maybe it's like guessing the outcome of a football match or something like that, believe it or not, the experts plus naive participants will be right more often than just the experts combined. And that's not to say we don't need experts. Experts are definitely good at seeing the world. But when you become an expert, you actually put blinders on that miss certain cues that might be relevant. So, for example, in the United States, we had Frank Lloyd Wright, amazing architect. Challenge is his buildings are falling apart. So it would have been much better to have Frank Lloyd Wright plus an engineer plus maybe a natural conservationist, and you would have had a much better outcome with that diverse group as opposed to just an expert architect. And so when you're building teams going forward, what I've been trying to sort of emphasize at Harvard is think about diversity, think about empowering the edge, and then lastly, you don't tell ants where to go. You know, anyone who tries to do that, you're going to fail. But what you can do is you can sprinkle sugar in certain places and chemicals in others, and the ants will explore the space and figure out the best way to get to the sugar, avoid the chemicals. So it's almost this indirect form of what are the nudges you can do. So I look forward to that. And then the Eisenhower role is continuing conversations just about this notion of organizing by geography.
Okay.
It may be increasingly getting quaint. You think about it, where's a packet of information on the internet? Is it where it's sent from or received by? And even if you do pass a law, well, what's to prevent someone saying, I'm going to move my servers to another country and your laws don't apply to me anymore?
And the classic one is the cloud, like, because obviously we're seeing with GDPR and stuff like that, it's kind of going, well, yes, the legislation is quite clear, but I can personally tell you that I couldn't give you the physical location of where even the data from this recording we're doing is being stored.
Right.
You know, it's like, you know, it's too ephemeral, like. So these are sort of, you know, real sort of, you know, what are we as people type questions we're looking at now.
And how do we organize? And I like to point out the printing press predated the Treaty of Westphalia, which gave rise to the idea of sovereignty by about 200 years. So should we not be surprised that the internet, much like the printing press, it may give rise to new notions of how we organize. Now, what I would like is to have conversations before we go too far down that road and figure out what is the best way that it gives the most advantages to everybody. What I'm worried about is we're starting to organize by affinity groups. And what I worry about is if you organize by affinity group in which you only socialize with people that think the same way you do, that only tolerate the same views as you do, and you don't tolerate anyone else who thinks differently, that's not either a representative democracy or a republic. That's an autocracy. And that's kind of worrisome. And so I'd like to have the conversations before we go too far down that road and say, maybe there's some other way of organizing.
And it also comes back to the experts and naive groups, and that, like, you know, when you get that blend, it helps more.
I agree. And I think I personally believe in pluralities as being good things. In fact, the philosopher Rousseau, back in the 1700s, said that democracies were corrupt because they only encouraged self-interest. But what you wanted was a plurality which was healthy self-interest plus thinking about the good of the community. And that you didn't need everybody to think about the good of the community. He actually said you only needed about 1 in 5. But can we do the same thing online, which is, can we find those people that are willing to be those positive change agents that balance healthy self-interest, but also thinking about the good of the whole, good of the community?
See, I always just forget that's what dog pictures are for.
Yes.
It's like,
Memes.
It's like, memes. Like, because I'll be there, it's like something terrible has happened. Oh, but that dog is very cute. 13 out of 10. So it's kind of going. That's the balance of my life, like because I'm a journalist. Even I find the news scary these days. I suppose, and the last thing really, David, I want to ask you about, because given you are at the data summit here in Dublin. What sort of, is a general thing you're hoping people take away from what you're talking about here?
Sure. So I've enjoyed the conversations to get Ireland's perspective as well as the other attendees. We just had today Vint, Cerf, and then Shari Langemark from Germany. I mean,
Vint's voice is so ridiculously smooth as well, isn't it?
Yeah, well, and he's a snappy dresser too.
Yeah, that too. Yeah.
Just to recognize that there is no textbook for where we're going with this world. And different nations are going to have different perspectives. Within nations, you're also going to have different perspectives. And so can we find safe spaces to, one, discuss these ideas and not devolve into vitriol? But then, two, can we actually fund some experiments? Because we have to figure out how to move forward. And I like to point out that supposedly when the Constitution was signed in the United States, Ben Franklin said he could rest easy knowing the great American experiment would exist for the next 50 years. That was 240 years ago. So we may be due up for some new experiments. And the jury's out. Actually, apparently for the first 100 years of the U.S., apparently England was actually having betting pools that representative democracy was going to fail. So, so it's interesting bits of historical footnotes. But I use the word experiment because the words expertise and experiment both have the word experia, meaning out of danger. And that the only way you get expertise is you do dangerous things that won't always work out. The question, though, is increasingly as we become more 24/7 transparent and everyone's looking at what you do, if I fail once in government, that's a black mark. If I fail twice, I'm probably out of a job. And so where are those safe spaces, and maybe they're a combination of public-private partnerships, to do experiments to try and figure out how we make sense of how we exist as societies, how we make sense of this internet world, that allow us to take risks, that are not just all Silicon Valley based, and have multiple national reviews. And that to me is, this conference to me is exciting because I feel like there are positive change agents with different views coexisting and sharing momentum as to how we can move forward.
And that was David Bray speaking to me at the Dublin Data Summit in June. And well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Connected. I hope you all found that as fascinating as I did. David was quite a good bit of crack, I gotta say. And it's going to be interesting to see where he goes from here with his future work and all that. As for where we're going, well, we have a show coming up next week of a TBD nature. It might be studio, it might not. We're still working out exactly what that's going to involve. So when we know, well, no, actually, no. When we know, we'll know. You won't know when we know, because we'll know before you know. But we hope to know in an ample time that we can do it right. If not, it'll be another show kind of like this, which is doable, but not preferable. And ideally we'll be in the studio with a pretty good show, I think, the one I have in mind. If not, that'll be our first show after I'm back from my holidays. And it's looking promising. It's been great. And as always, I want to thank the Cult of Connected for your continued support. Please do subscribe to us on iTunes or whatever you listen to podcasts. And if possible, leave a review, not just because I need the personal gratification, but because it overall helps our findability really on podcast networks. So basically we're more likely to come up with suggested searches for people who are into the stuff that Cult of Connected is into, and so more people find us organically that way. So please do subscribe, leave a review, ideally a positive one, like, the most positive possible if possible. Go on, be nice and all that. And that's basically that. So as ever, I want to thank our sponsors, Dell EMC. And until next time, I will somehow, some way remain being Emmett Ryan.